the racist cop who attacked a black woman in court, without knowing she was his new police chief. The courtroom was thick with tension. The air conditioner hummed, but it did little to cool the heat radiating from the packed benches. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture the spectacle. Officer Ryan Calloway sat at the defendant's table, his expression twisted in boredom. His fingers drummed against the polished wood, his body language oozing arrogance. This was just another hearing, another inconvenience. He had been through this before. False accusations, baseless complaints. None of it ever stuck. He was untouchable and he knew it. The judge, an older black woman with steel in her eyes, cleared her throat and glanced at the file before her. Officer Calloway, you stand accused of excessive force during a traffic stop involving an unarmed civilian. Video evidence shows you striking the driver after they complied with your commands. How do you plead? Calloway scoffed. Not guilty, he said, smirking. His lawyer barely looked up, already prepared for another wrist slap at worst. In the front row, Aaliyah Cole sat silently, her hands clasped on her lap. She was dressed in a sharp navy suit, her presence unassuming, but there was something in her posture, something deliberate, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment. Her dark brown skin gleamed under the courtroom lights, and her gaze never wavered from Calloway. She was here to observe, to listen, to confirm what she already knew. A man stood from the prosecution's table. Your Honor, the state would like to present footage taken from Officer Calloway's body cam. The screen flickered to life. The courtroom watched as Calloway pulled over a young black man, barely in his 20s. The footage showed the officer barking orders, the driver obeying without hesitation. Then came the blow, a brutal, unnecessary strike to the stomach. The young man doubled over in pain before being slammed against the hood of the car. The video stopped. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Calloway leaned back in his chair, unbothered. Standard procedure, he muttered under his breath. Aaliyah stood then, her voice smooth and measured. Officer Calloway, can you explain why you struck an unarmed, compliant civilian? Calloway turned, sizing her up. His blue eyes flicked over her, dismissing her immediately. Another activist, another loudmouth coming for his badge. He smirked. Lady, you don't know how the streets work. You don't know what it's like to be in my shoes. Aaliyah tilted her head. Enlighten me. Calloway chuckled, looking her up and down with disdain. These thugs, you give 'em an inch, they'll take a mile. I don't hesitate. That's why I'm still standing here while my so-called victims are crying about bruises. A sharp intake of breath came from the crowd. Even the judge arched an eyebrow. Calloway didn't care. He was used to this, people acting outraged, but at the end of the day the system protected him. Aaliyah took a step closer. And what about when the thugs aren't on the streets? What about when they wear badges? His smirk faltered. What the hell does that mean? She didn't answer. Instead she held his gaze, her calmness pressing down on him in a way he couldn't place. He was used to defiance, to anger. But this quiet, unwavering control, unnerved him. Then she smiled, small but certain. Something in her face set him off. Before he could think, he grabbed her wrist. The motion was swift, aggressive. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She merely looked down at his hand, then back at his face. Officer Calloway, the judge barked. Unhand her this instant. He let go, stepping back, his nostrils flaring. She got in my face, he muttered, but for the first time, his voice lacked conviction. The doors burst open. A bailiff rushed in, out of breath. Your Honor, he said, glancing around. The new police chief has arrived. The judge straightened. Excellent. We'll take a brief recess. Aaliyah lifted a hand. No need, she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a gleaming gold badge, holding it up for the entire room to see. A slow, suffocating silence spread through the courtroom. Ryan Calloway's face drained of color. Aaliyah Cole turned back to him, her smile never fading. Surprise! Ryan Calloway sat frozen. His breath caught in his throat. The badge in Aaliyah Cole's hand gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its weight heavier than anything he had ever faced in court. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled, rippling through the crowd like a rising tide. Reporters whispered frantically, their fingers flying over keyboards, while the judge's gavel slammed down to restore order. "Officer Calloway," the judge said, her voice like iron, "it appears you've just assaulted your superior." Calloway's mind raced. Oh, this couldn't be real. He had read about the city's appointment of a new police chief, but no name had stuck in his mind. And even if it had, this woman. He had assumed she was a protester, a lawyer at most, certainly not someone who could outrank him. His fingers clenched into fists. This is some kind of joke," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But Aaliyah didn't laugh. She merely slipped the badge back into her pocket and took a step closer. "I assure you, Officer Calloway," she said smoothly, "this is very real." The weight of her words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He turned his head sharply, searching for backup. His lawyer sat stiff and pale, avoiding his gaze. The other officers in the room, some of whom had once shared drinks and complaints with him, were unreadable. A few had straightened in their seats, their postures suddenly professional, distancing themselves from his sinking ship. Aaliyah's expression was unreadable as well, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet power that made his skin crawl. "You see," she continued, pacing in front of the courtroom like she owned it, "I came here today to observe, to understand the culture I'm stepping into. And I must say," she paused, turning her gaze directly on Calloway, "you've given me quite the introduction." A few officers exchanged uneasy glances. Calloway swallowed hard. He needed to regain control, to flip the script before it was too late. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, forcing a smirk. "You're setting me up. I didn't know who you were." Aaliyah's lips curled slightly. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it? You didn't care to know. You looked at me and decided I was beneath you." She tilted her head. "Tell me, Officer Calloway, would you have put your hands on the last chief this way?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His heart pounded. The judge sighed. "Given the circumstances, Chief Cole, would you like to file charges against Officer Calloway for assault?" The question hung in the air, the entire courtroom holding its breath. Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. She studied Calloway, taking her time. He felt like an insect under a magnifying glass. Then she shook her head. "Not today," she said, and the exhale of collective relief was almost audible. "Officer Calloway will have much bigger things to answer for soon enough." A chill ran down Calloway's spine. The judge nodded. "In that case, this hearing will resume as scheduled. Officer Calloway, I'd advise you to stay seated and keep your hands to yourself." He barely heard her. His mind was spiraling. This woman had power now, real power. And if she was here to observe, that meant she was here to clean house. And he was first on the chopping block. When court adjourned, Calloway stormed out, shoving past reporters as they shouted questions at him. He barely made it to the hallway before he heard the soft, deliberate click of heels behind him. "Running away, officer." He turned sharply. Aaliyah stood a few feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You don't belong here," he spat. "You don't know how things work in this department." Aaliyah let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You're right," she said. "But I will. And when I do, I'll know exactly where you stand in it." Calloway felt the invisible walls closing in around him. He wasn't sure what was more infuriating, the fact that she had power over him now or the fact that she wasn't afraid of him at all. Ryan Calloway sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The anger simmering in his chest refused to settle, growing hotter with every replay of the courtroom humiliation. He had spent years navigating the system, skirting the consequences of his so-called aggressive policing. But now everything had changed. The woman he had dismissed, mocked, wasn't just some activist or defense attorney. She was his boss. He slammed a fist against the dashboard, cursing under his breath. He knew what was coming. Aaliyah Cole wasn't going to let this go. She had the authority to dig into his past, to unearth everything he'd worked to keep buried. He needed to act before she did. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts and found a familiar name. Sergeant Dan Hollister. Calloway's closest ally in the department. A man who understood that law and order meant keeping people in line, even if it meant bending the rules. He pressed the call button. "Ryan," Hollister answered. "Heard about what happened in court. Hell of a mess you got yourself into." "You think?" Calloway snapped. "We have a problem, Dan. That woman's going to tear this department apart." There was a pause. "What do you want to do about it?" Calloway glanced around before lowering his voice. "We need to remind her who really runs this city. If she wants a fight, we'll give her one." Hollister sighed. "Careful, Ryan. This isn't just another complaint we can make disappear. She's the chief now." "For now," Calloway muttered. The call ended, but his mind raced with possibilities. He had spent years surviving by knowing the right people, pulling the right strings. Aaliyah Cole might have walked into this department thinking she could change things, but Calloway knew better. This city didn't change. It chewed people up and spit them out. And if she thought she could bring him down, she had another thing coming. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, Aaliyah sat in her new office, sifting through a thick stack of reports. The walls were still bare, the furniture stiff, but the weight of her new position was already pressing down on her. She had expected resistance. She had expected hostility. But the look on Calloway's face in court had told her something else. He wasn't just angry. He was afraid. And men like him were dangerous when they were afraid. Her assistant, Detective Naomi Carter, knocked on the door. "Chief, you need to see this." Aaliyah looked up as Naomi set a file on the desk. She opened it, her eyes narrowing as she read the contents. "Excessive force complaints," Naomi said. "Dozens of them. All against Calloway. Most of them were either dismissed or buried under internal investigations." Aaliyah let out a slow breath. "How deep does this go?" Naomi hesitated before answering. "Deep. And he's not the only one." Aaliyah closed the file and leaned back in her chair. This was exactly what she expected, what she came here for. The system had protected Calloway for years, shielding him from consequences. But that shield was about to break. "We're reopening these cases," she said firmly. "And I want to know who helped him cover them up." Naomi gave a sharp nod. "Understood." As she left, Aaliyah stared at the closed door, her mind racing. Calloway wouldn't go down quietly. He was too arrogant, too entrenched in the old ways. But he was also predictable. And if he thought he could outmaneuver her, he was about to learn exactly why she had been chosen for this job. The storm was coming. And this time, Calloway wouldn't be the one holding the power. Ryan Calloway stepped into the locker room at the precinct, his pulse pounding. The usual chatter among officers fell silent as he walked past, their eyes flickering with something between curiosity and caution. News of what had happened in court had spread like wildfire, and everyone knew that Chief Aaliyah Cole wasn't wasting any time. He yanked open his locker, shoving his bag inside. A heavy hand clapped down on his shoulder, and he turned sharply to see Sergeant Dan Hollister standing beside him, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," Hollister said, his voice low. Calloway glanced around. Several officers were pretending not to listen, but he knew better. He slammed his locker shut and jerked his head toward the back exit. "Not here." They stepped outside into the alley behind the precinct, where the city's low hum filled the silence between them. Hollister lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply before speaking. "You were right," he said. "Cole's making moves. Reopen some of those cases against you. She's digging." Calloway clenched his jaw. "Then we need to stop her before she buries us." Hollister exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the air. Easier said than done. We had protection before, but Cole's changing the rules. I heard Internal Affairs is already sniffing around. A sharp, ugly laugh escaped Calloway's throat. You think IA is gonna do anything? I've been through this before. They take a few statements, slap a warning on my file, and move on. This time is different, Hollister said. She's not just looking at excessive force reports. She's looking at cover-ups, the chain of command, who signed off on what. If she keeps pushing, she's gonna find things we can't explain away. Calloway took a step closer. Then we push back. Make her job harder. Get the union involved, call in favors, whatever it takes. Hollister flicked the cigarette away. There's something else. She's putting together a task force. Hand-picking detectives. People she trusts. He met Calloway's gaze. You know what that means. Calloway's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what that meant. Once Cole had her team in place, she wouldn't just be reopening cases. She'd be hunting him. Back inside the precinct, Aaliyah sat in her office, her desk covered with files, some new, some old and yellowed from years of neglect. Naomi Carter stood beside her, arms crossed. We have enough to suspend Calloway, Naomi said. If we push, we can have him off the force by the end of the week. Aaliyah tapped her fingers against the desk. No, she said. Naomi blinked. No. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair. Suspending him now lets him play the victim. He'll cry about politics, say he's being targeted. That's how men like him survive. They make themselves look like the ones under attack. So what do we do? Aaliyah's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. We let him destroy himself. Naomi frowned, but understanding flickered in her eyes. Calloway wasn't just a bad cop. He was arrogant, reckless. If they let him feel the pressure without making a move just yet, he'd lash out. And when he did, he'd expose himself in ways no internal investigation ever could. We monitor him, Aaliyah continued. Every step he takes, every call he makes. If he so much as breathes wrong, I want to know about it. Naomi nodded. Consider it done. As she left the office, Aaliyah leaned forward, staring down at the open files. This wasn't just about Calloway. This was about every officer like him. The ones who thought they were untouchable. That was about to change. And Calloway was going to be the first lesson. Ryan Calloway sat at a dimly lit bar, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. The sharp burn in his throat did nothing to calm the fire raging in his chest. He was losing control and he knew it. The precinct was different now. Officers who used to nod in quiet support were keeping their distance. The ones who had once laughed at his racist jokes now avoided eye contact. Even Hollister had been unusually cautious. Aaliyah Cole had flipped the script on him, and he could feel the walls closing in. Every shift felt like a test, like someone was watching and waiting for him to make a mistake. His reputation had once made him untouchable. Now he was being cornered like an animal. A heavy-set man slid into the seat across from him, setting down a beer with a casual smirk. Rough week. Calloway glared at him. What do you want, Franklin? Detective Jason Franklin leaned forward, voice low. Word is, IA is already looking at your old cases. Cole's building a task force. If she gets enough evidence, you won't just lose your badge. You'll be in a cell. Calloway clenched his jaw. I'm not going down over this. Not because of her. Franklin took a slow sip of his beer, considering. You could fight this the smart way. Get ahead of it. Make her look unstable, like she's got a personal vendetta. Calloway scoffed. How? Franklin gave a knowing smile. You know how this works. A little planted evidence. A staged altercation. Get the right people to say the right things and suddenly she's the problem, not you. The idea was tempting. It was how things had always been done. But Calloway's gut told him Cole wasn't like the others. She wouldn't scare easy, and she damn sure wouldn't back down. Still, he couldn't just sit and wait for her to take him down. He had to act first. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Aaliyah sat in the surveillance room, watching footage of Calloway's past arrests. Case after case showed the same pattern: aggression, intimidation, excessive force. But the system had protected him. Till now. Naomi Carter stepped inside, holding a folder. "We've got something." Aaliyah paused the footage and took the folder, flipping it open. Her eyes scanned the report, and a slow smile spread across her face. "This is it," she murmured. Naomi nodded. "An old case from 5 years ago. Calloway arrested a black teenager for resisting arrest. The kid ended up in the hospital with a broken jaw. No body cam footage, no formal complaint, just Calloway's word against the boys. But guess what?" Aaliyah looked up. The kid's mother kept evidence. Photos. Medical records. A witness statement from a neighbor who saw the whole thing. And now that Cole's in charge, she's willing to talk. Aaliyah exhaled slowly. This is what we needed. If they could reopen that case, it would be more than just another complaint. It would be proof of Calloway's pattern of abuse, the first real crack in his armor. Naomi hesitated. "There's one problem. Calloway's already sniffing around. If he catches wind of this before we move, he'll bury it." Aaliyah's expression hardened. "Then we move fast." The next morning, Calloway arrived at the precinct to find an unusual tension in the air. Officers whispered in small groups, side-eyeing him as he walked past. He ignored them, heading straight to his desk. Then he saw the email. Internal Affairs had officially reopened the case from 5 years ago. A meeting was set. Testimonies would be taken. Evidence reviewed. His stomach twisted. He was being hunted, and this time there was no easy escape. He glanced toward Aaliyah's office, where the blinds were drawn. He could almost feel her presence, like a predator watching its prey. For the first time in his career, Ryan Calloway felt real fear. Ryan Calloway gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car so tightly his knuckles turned white. His whole body was rigid, every muscle tensed with rage. The precinct was turning against him. Aaliyah Cole wasn't just coming for his job. She was coming for his entire life. And now, with that old case reopened, she had a real chance of bringing him down. He had spent years operating with impunity, confident that no one would dare challenge him. But Cole wasn't backing down. She had the power now, and worse, she had the support of people who used to stay silent. His phone buzzed. A message from Franklin. "We need to talk. Urgent." Without thinking, he made a sharp turn and sped toward the meeting spot, an abandoned lot near the old shipping docks, far from any security cameras. Franklin was already there, leaning against his car, arms crossed. "You're losing control," Franklin said as Calloway stepped out. Calloway scoffed. "No thanks to you. You said we'd shut her down, but she's got the whole damn precinct on her side. A is crawling all over my record. If I go down, I'm not going alone." Franklin's expression darkened. "Watch yourself, Ryan. You start talking like that, and you'll have more enemies than just Cole." Calloway exhaled sharply, trying to contain his frustration. "What's the plan?" Franklin hesitated, then spoke carefully. "We need leverage. Something that makes her untouchable reputation look dirty. A reason for the department to turn against her." Calloway narrowed his eyes. "And how do we do that?" Franklin glanced around before lowering his voice. "We stage something. A complaint against her. Something that makes IA focus on her instead of you." The idea was tempting, but Calloway knew it wouldn't be enough. Cole was too smart to be caught in a trap that simple. And with the pressure mounting, he was running out of time. Back at the precinct, Aaliyah sat in her office, reading through the latest witness statements. The mother of the teenager Calloway had brutalized years ago had provided everything they needed. Photographs, hospital records, even a neighbor's testimony. Naomi entered the office, shutting the door behind her. IA is ready to move forward. They want to interview Calloway tomorrow. Aaliyah nodded. Good. Let him squirm a little. Naomi hesitated. There's something else. Word is, Calloway's been meeting with Franklin off the record. I don't like it. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair. Neither do I. She knew men like Calloway didn't go down quietly. He would fight, scheme, and do whatever it took to protect himself. But she was ready for him. Have someone keep an eye on them, she said. If they try anything, I want to know before they even finish the thought. That night, Calloway sat alone in his apartment, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle. He could feel his life slipping through his fingers. His career, his reputation, his power, everything he had built was crumbling. Aaliyah Cole had flipped his world upside down, and if he didn't act fast, she would bury him. He picked up his phone and dialed Franklin. It's time, he said. We take her down tomorrow. But what Calloway didn't know was that Aaliyah was already 3 steps ahead of him. The tension in the precinct was suffocating. Every officer moved with quiet urgency, whispering in small clusters, casting quick glances at Ryan Calloway as he sat stiffly at his desk. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment, their silent anticipation of what was to come. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Internal Affairs had scheduled his interview for noon, but Calloway had no intention of sitting through it like a helpless target. He wasn't going down without a fight. Franklin had promised a way out, a final shot at flipping the tables on Cole before she could destroy him completely. His phone vibrated. A single message from Franklin. Rooftop. 10 minutes. Calloway pushed back from his desk, moving with forced nonchalance toward the stairwell. No one stopped him, but he could tell that people were watching, waiting. He clenched his jaw. This department used to respect him. Now they were vultures circling. When he stepped onto the rooftop, Franklin was already there, leaning against the railing. His expression unreadable. This is bad, Ryan, Franklin said without preamble. IA's got real evidence. Cole played this perfectly. Calloway growled. So what's the move? You said we had a plan. Franklin exhaled. We did. But it's not gonna work. Calloway's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Franklin turned to face him fully. You're toxic, man. The department isn't protecting you anymore. You're a liability, and I can't be tied to a sinking ship. Rage flared in Calloway's chest. You're bailing on me. Franklin's expression was cold. Self-preservation. You should try it. Calloway took a step forward, fists clenching, but the rooftop door suddenly swung open. Aaliyah Cole stepped out, her uniform crisp, her presence commanding. Behind her, 2 IA agents flanked the doorway. Morning, Calloway, she said smoothly. Hell of a day, isn't it? His heart pounded. He knew this was a trap. I would like a word, Aaliyah continued, stepping closer. But I think we both know how this ends. Calloway's mind raced. He could fight this. He could. If you are enjoying this video, I would really appreciate it if you could give this video a like. While you are there, click on the subscribe button and also turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Your patrol car was searched this morning, Aaliyah said, cutting off his thoughts. Guess what we found? She tossed a manila folder onto the ground in front of him. The wind flipped it open, revealing printed emails, surveillance photos, bank statements. Franklin let out a low whistle. Damn! Calloway's mouth went dry. This is evidence. Aaliyah finished for him. Your little side deals. The money laundering. The intimidation tactics. We have it all. And thanks to an anonymous tip, IA has been compiling it for weeks. Franklin smirked. Oops. Calloway's world tilted. Franklin had turned on him. He was the anonymous tip. You set me up, Calloway whispered, barely able to breathe. Franklin shrugged. Like I said, self-preservation. Aaliyah tilted her head. You were so focused on taking me down you never saw it coming, did you? The rooftop spun. He had been untouchable for so long. Now, in front of his peers, his enemies, his former allies, he was nothing. Ryan Calloway, one of the IA agents said, stepping forward. You're under arrest. The words barely registered before they snapped the cuffs around his wrists. Aaliyah stepped in close, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're done." As Calloway was led away, the entire precinct watched. Some whispered, some smirked. No one moved to help him. And Aaliyah Cole stood tall, watching justice finally take its course.